Long before the first man took his faltering steps upon the soil of the earth, there was a world already old with memory. The story of humanity is not merely the story of one man or of one people. It is the story of survival against the indifference of nature, the slow shaping of intelligence out of raw instinct, and the quiet, uncertain dawn of a species that would one day dominate every corner of the planet. Yet before there was man, there was a wilderness of unimaginable scale and silence, a theater of life where other creatures ruled long before us. To understand the first man, we must first enter a world in which he did not exist. Imagine the earth not as we know it today, but as it was several million years ago. The landscape stretched vast and untamed, marked by towering volcanoes, endless savannas, and primeval forests. Herds of giant beasts thundered across the plains, early elephants with curving tusks, saber-toothed predators whose fangs gleamed in the fading sun, and packs of hyenas far larger than those we know today. It was a place where survival balanced precariously on the edge of tooth and claw, where every shadow concealed the threat of death. This was Africa, the cradle of all humankind. The continent we now know as the heart of human origins was already ancient, sculpted by shifting tectonic plates and divided by the mighty Rift Valley. Here, mountains split open, lakes filled with rain, and rivers carved their way through the earth, leaving behind the sediments that would one day guard the fossilized remains of our earliest ancestors. Africa was not merely a continent, it was a womb, and from its depths, the first whispers of humanity would eventually emerge. But humanity did not arrive fully formed. The first man was not a single individual, standing suddenly upright and aware, but the product of an unbroken chain of ancestors stretching back millions of years. To glimpse him, we must turn our eyes to the long march of evolution. Roughly 7 million years ago, somewhere in the wooded savannas of Central Africa, a creature now known as Sahelanthropus cadensis walked a narrow path between ape and human. From its skull, small, with a flattened face and heavy brow ridges, scientists believe it could walk upright, if only clumsily. It was not human, but in its bones we see the faintest glimmer of the path that would one day lead to us. It represents one of the earliest known divergences from the great apes, a whisper at the dawn of the human story. Over the next few million years, Africa became a vast laboratory of evolution. From Australopithecus afarensis, whose delicate bones were unearthed in the famous skeleton Lucy in Ethiopia, to the ancient footprints preserved at Litoli in Tanzania, hardened impressions in volcanic ash that record the steps of beings who walked upright nearly 3.6 million years ago. The continent holds the earliest evidence of a shift that would transform all of history: bipedalism. The Litoli footprints tell a story no words could capture. Two individuals, perhaps a man and a woman, perhaps parent and child, walked together across soft volcanic ash. Their gait was upright, their stride purposeful. They did not know they were leaving behind one of the earliest testimonies of humanity's ascent. To them, it was simply a walk across the land, perhaps fleeing danger or searching for food. To us, it is the frozen moment when we recognize something unmistakably human. Still, these beings were not yet men. They lived short, brutal lives. Their brains were small, their tools crude, if they had tools at all. They slept in trees to avoid predators, scavenged carcasses for meat, and survived in family groups where cooperation was the thin line between life and extinction. Yet in their upright posture, in the hands that could grasp and carry, the possibility of the future was already written. By 2 million years ago, the world witnessed the rise of a new kind of being, Homo habilis, the handyman. From the stones they left behind, sharp edges flaked with deliberate skill, archaeologists know these were the first true toolmakers. To strike one stone against another and fashion an edge was to cross a threshold into intentionality, foresight, and problem-solving. It was the first murmur of the intelligence that would come to define humanity. Here, at the dawn of the genus Homo, we stand at the shadowed edge of our story. The first man in the world would not yet have recognized himself as something separate, as something destined for dominion. He was still prey as much as predator, still part of a wider ecosystem that dwarfed him. Lions, leopards, and crocodiles held dominion. And yet, slowly, imperceptibly, something was changing. The climate was restless. Ice ages advanced and retreated in cycles, sculpting the earth and forcing our ancestors to adapt or die. Forests shrank into grasslands, and the grasslands expanded into deserts. In this crucible of instability, intelligence was forged. The first man, if we dare call him that, was a child of hardship, of shifting landscapes that demanded innovation, memory, and cooperation. Without the cruelty of climate, there may never have been the spark of mind that would separate humanity from the beasts around it. The Rift Valley became the archive of this transformation. Fossils lay hidden in its sediments, skulls with expanding brain cases, jaws that narrowed, teeth that grew smaller, pelvises shaped for walking. Each discovery tells us not of a single first man, but of a lineage of beings, each a little closer to what we now recognize as human. It is tempting to ask, who was the first man in the world? Science cannot give us a single name, a single face. No, Adam was standing alone in the dawn light. There was instead a continuum, a gradual emergence, a tide that rose so slowly no individual could have known he was the beginning. What we call the first man was, in truth, countless men and women, families and tribes, each carrying forward a fragment of the story. And yet, myths speak differently. Across the world, civilizations have told of a single first man, shaped from clay, carved from wood, or born of the breath of gods. These stories do not concern themselves with evolution or fossil strata. They are concerned with meaning. They ask not, how did we come to be, but why do we exist at all? And perhaps that is why they endure. Because in the vast silence of deep time, the scientific truth alone feels too cold, too indifferent, to satisfy the yearning of the human spirit. The prologue of our story, then, is not about an individual man. It is about a world waiting for him. A world of dangers and opportunities, of shifting climate and restless earth, of beasts that ruled and beings that dreamed. Out of this crucible, the first man would emerge not as a sudden miracle, but as the final note in a long symphony of evolution. When we turn the page from this prologue, we will begin to see him more clearly. His hands will grasp tools of his own making. His mind will spark with ideas that echo down to us. And though he will not yet know it, the first man will stand at the threshold of history, about to take a step that no creature before him had taken. There are moments in history so fleeting, so fragile, that they should never have been preserved at all. And yet, by a miracle of geology, they remain with us today, silent testimonies of beings who lived long before the first civilizations, before the first written words, before even the idea of history itself. Among the most haunting are the Litoli footprints, pressed into volcanic ash nearly 4 million years ago, in the lands we now call Tanzania. The footprints belong not to giants or beasts, but to a pair of small, upright walkers, our ancient cousins of the species Australopithecus afarensis. Their feet, human-like in shape, left a trail across soft ash that hardened under the sun and was later sealed beneath layers of stone. When they were uncovered in the 1970s by Mary Leakey and her team, the world stared in awe. For the first time, we were not looking at a skull or a jawbone, not at lifeless fragments of bone. We were looking at the actual steps of beings who had lived and breathed. It is tempting to imagine who they were. Perhaps a man and a woman walking side by side. Perhaps a parent and child moving cautiously through a dangerous landscape. Were they fleeing a predator, searching for food, or simply walking, unaware that every stride carried a weight of destiny, that in their footprints, the very story of humanity had begun to take shape. For here, in these tracks, lies the proof of one of the most important transformations in history: bipedalism. To walk upright was to liberate the hands, to carry food, tools, and eventually, children. It was to see farther across the savannah, to watch for predators, to plan, and to anticipate. It was the first step toward becoming something entirely new. But walking on two legs was not an easy gift. The skeleton paid a price for its new posture. The spine curved, the pelvis reshaped, the birth canal narrowed. To give birth became more dangerous, the pain greater, the risks higher. Yet the evolutionary gamble held, because it allowed these creatures to survive in a world that was changing fast. The Africa of 3 to 4 million years ago was a continent in flux. Forests were receding, giving way to grasslands and open plains. The predators that roamed these lands were formidable giant hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and crocodiles lurking in rivers. For a small, upright creature with little natural defense, survival demanded something new: intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability. The first footprints remind us of fragility, but they also mark the dawn of resilience. These early hominins, though not yet men in any sense we would recognize, were carving a place for themselves in a hostile world. Their hands, freed by upright walking, began to shape the earliest tools. At Oldoway Gorge, in modern-day Tanzania, stone flakes have been found that date back nearly 2 million years. Fashioned by Homo habilis, the handyman, these were not mere rocks, but deliberately shaped implements. With them, our ancestors could cut meat, crack bones for marrow, and defend themselves against predators. The making of a tool was more than survival. It was foresight, imagination, the ability to see not just what a stone was, but what it could become. To strike one rock against another, to flake off a sharp edge, was an act of transformation. It was the first echo of a mind that could dream, the beginning of a story that would end with rockets piercing the heavens and machines shaping worlds. But in those days, it was enough to split open the bones of fallen beasts and scrape flesh from carcasses left by lions. The footprints and tools tell us of survival, but bones tell us of life and of death. Among the most famous is the skeleton of the Turkana boy, discovered near Lake Turkana in Kenya. At 1.6 million years old, he was a member of Homo erectus, standing taller and more robust than his predecessors. His body already adapted for long-distance running under the African sun. His skull shows a larger brain, and his frame shows the strength of endurance. Yet he died young, perhaps at 8 or 9 years old, his body preserved by the sands. The Turkana boy's bones tell of a child who carried within him the promise of manhood, a boy who never lived to see his full strength, but whose kind would carry fire across continents, build rafts to cross seas, and outlast beasts far stronger than themselves. His story reminds us that the path to the first man was paved with countless lives cut short, with fragile children and struggling families, with the constant toll of mortality. It is easy to think of humanity's story as one of triumph, but in truth, it was written in hunger and fear. The early men and women who left their footprints at Litoli, who shaped stone at Oldoway, who buried their dead at the edge of rivers, they were not conquerors. They were survivors. Their world was dangerous, their lives short, their numbers few. But their legacy lies not in dominance, but in persistence. They endured, and in enduring, they left traces that whisper to us across millions of years. And yet, across cultures, we remember this differently. Myths tell us that the first man appeared suddenly, created by divine hands. In the Abrahamic traditions, Adam was molded from dust and given life by the breath of God. In Mesopotamian tales, the first man was shaped by the gods from clay mixed with the blood of a slain deity. In African oral traditions, the first people often emerge from the ground itself, as if the soil could no longer contain them. These myths speak of a sudden beginning, of a moment when man stepped into the world fully formed. But the footprints, the bones, and the tools tell another story, that our beginnings were slow, uncertain, and fragile. That the first man was not one man, but many. Not a miracle, but a struggle. And yet, perhaps the myths and the science are not so far apart. To ancient peoples, the creation of man was too profound to be told as a gradual tale. They needed a story of immediacy, of divine will, of sudden breath. Science, on the other hand, asks for patience, millions of years, countless generations, and endless change. Between the two lies the truth that humanity emerged not in a single instant, but that the moment was so profound, it felt like creation itself. So we return to the first footprints, still pressed into the earth. They belong to beings who are gone, who never knew what they had begun. They did not know that one day their children's children would build civilizations, sail oceans, and map the stars. They knew only the next step, the next meal, the next day. But in their footsteps, all of history was waiting. The story of the first man begins here, not with Adam or with kings, not with empires or temples, but with fragile prints in the dust, leading onward into a future unseen. For millions of years, the earth had been inhabited by creatures who looked almost human, but not quite. They walked upright, shaped tools, and even cared for their young. Yet something about them remained incomplete. Their minds were still bound by instinct, their hands clumsy, their voices little more than guttural sounds carried on the wind. And then, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, in the heart of Africa, something extraordinary happened. A new kind of being emerged, one that would come to call itself human. The fossil record tells us that this transformation took place in Africa's shifting landscapes, in the highlands of Ethiopia, the savannas of East Africa, and the mountains of Morocco. It was there, in 2017, that archaeologists unearthed the remains of what may be the oldest Homo sapiens ever discovered at Jebel Irhoud. The fossils, dated to nearly 300,000 years ago, included fragments of skulls, jaws, and teeth, belonging to people who, if dressed in modern clothes, might pass unnoticed among us. Their faces were flatter than their ancestors, their brains larger, their bodies fully human in form. These were not just clever apes. These were us. To call this moment the birth of our kind is both accurate and misleading. Accurate, because it marks the point when anatomically modern humans first appeared. Misleading, because there was no single day when one child was born different from all who came before. Evolution does not work in sudden leaps, but in gradual tides. And yet, looking back across the abyss of time, this is the moment when we can say with confidence, the first true men and women walked the earth. What made them different? It was not only the size of their brains, though those had grown considerably compared to earlier species. It was not only their ability to fashion tools, though theirs were finer, sharper, and more varied. What truly set them apart was something less tangible, yet infinitely more powerful: imagination. These early humans could think not just of the world as it was, but of the world as it might be. They could plan for tomorrow, recall the past, and share those thoughts through language. Their tongues, their throats, their brains had evolved to form words, and with words came stories, instructions, warnings, and dreams. This was the birth not only of man's body, but of his mind. Science has given names to our earliest ancestors within this lineage. Genetic studies point us to mitochondrial Eve, a woman who lived in Africa perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, whose mitochondrial DNA is carried, in some form, by every human alive today. She was not the only woman of her time, nor even the first, but she is the common ancestor of us all. In the same way, Geneticists speak of Y-chromosomal Adam, a man who lived tens of thousands of years ago, from whom all modern male lineages descend. Together, they remind us that humanity's story is both collective and deeply personal, that each of us carries within ourselves the memory of a man and a woman who once lived in Africa, whose children would spread across the world. The birth of our kind was not marked by triumph, but by survival. Life for those first humans was hard and often short. They hunted with sharpened spears and gathered roots and berries. They learned to master fire, not merely to cook, but to keep warm in the chill of night, to ward off predators, to gather in circles where stories could be told and fears shared. Around the firelight, humanity became something more than flesh. It became community. Archaeologists have found evidence of burials among early Homo sapiens at sites such as Kafza in Israel. Dating back nearly 100,000 years, skeletons have been found laid carefully in graves, sometimes accompanied by tools or ochre pigments. These were not casual disposals of the dead. They suggest a reverence for life, a recognition of death, and perhaps a belief in something beyond. Here, at the very dawn of our existence, we glimpse the beginnings of spirituality by the idea that life is not simply extinguished, but continues in some unseen realm. To think beyond death, to imagine what lies after, is a uniquely human burden. No other creature on earth has ever gazed at a lifeless body and wondered if the spirit lingers. Yet in those early graves, we see the stirrings of this haunting awareness. The first man was not only a survivor, he was a dreamer of eternity. But the world in which he lived was still shared with others. The first man in the world was not alone. Across Europe and Asia, the stocky and resilient Neanderthals thrived. In the mountains of Siberia, the mysterious Denisovans left behind fragments of their bones. In Africa itself, other hominin groups lingered, shadowy cousins whose names are only just being uncovered by science. For tens of thousands of years, humanity did not walk alone, but shared the earth with others who were almost human. The encounters between Homo sapiens and these other groups were not merely rivalries. DNA tells us that interbreeding took place, leaving traces in our genomes even today. In the blood of Europeans and Asians, fragments of Neanderthal DNA endure. In the people of Oceania, whispers of Denisovans remain. We are not the pure children of a single lineage. We are mosaics, carrying within us the legacy of vanished worlds. Still, it was Homo sapiens who endured, who spread, who flourished. Why? The answer lies in the very quality that marked our birth: adaptability. We were not the strongest, nor the fastest, nor the most fearsome, but we could adapt. We could imagine new tools, new strategies, new ways of living. We could share knowledge, not just within a family, but across generations. Culture became our survival tool, passed on like fire from one hand to the next. And so the first man in the world, if we imagine him, was not a solitary figure standing in the dawn. He was part of a family, a tribe, a community bound by ties of blood and language. He was not defined by his isolation, but by his connection. To be human is to be bound together. The myths echo this truth in their own way. In the Hebrew Bible, Adam is not alone for long. Eve is created to join him, and together they become the parents of all humanity. In Hindu tradition, Manu survives a great flood, not by himself, but by leading his people into a new age. In African tales, the first men and women often emerge in groups, not as solitary figures. Even in myth, the first man is never truly alone. The birth of our kind, then, was not an instant, but a dawn that stretched across thousands of years. From Morocco to Ethiopia, from caves in the Levant to the highlands of South Africa, scattered bands of humans lived, loved, hunted, buried their dead, and raised children who would inherit the earth. They were not yet farmers, not builders of cities, not yet writers of words. But they were us, in every sense that matters. When we look back on them now, we see not shadows, but mirrors. Their footprints are our footprints. Their hands are our hands. Their fears, their hopes, their dreams, they echo in us still. For the birth of our kind was not merely a moment in the past. It was the beginning of a story that continues to this day, written in our bones, our blood, and the fragile memories of a world long gone. For almost 200,000 years, our species lived only in Africa. There, in the forests and savannas, the first men and women hunted, gathered, and raised their children beneath the gaze of ancient stars. Africa was the cradle of humanity, the homeland of us all. But our story was never meant to remain confined within those boundaries. At some point, tens of thousands of years ago, a new impulse stirred within us, a restlessness, a hunger for horizons beyond sight. It was then that our ancestors began the most important journey ever undertaken, the long exodus out of Africa. The traces of this first great migration lie hidden in our DNA. Genetic studies suggest that all non-African people alive today descend from a single small population that left Africa perhaps 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Imagine them, a few hundred, perhaps a few thousand individuals, walking away from the familiar landscapes of their birth, following rivers, coastlines, and game trails into an unknown world. Their decision, or perhaps their necessity, set the course of history. Why did they leave? The reasons remain shrouded in speculation. Perhaps it was periods of drought that shrank forests and dried rivers, forcing our ancestors to seek new lands. Perhaps it was curiosity, an innate urge to explore, to follow the coastline until the land gave way to more. Or perhaps it was competition, too many mouths, too few resources, driving bands of humans to venture into the unknown. Whatever the cause, the effect was irreversible. Humanity became a species of travelers. The first exodus likely followed the coasts. Archaeologists have found evidence of early human presence in Arabia, in caves at Jebel Faya and along the shores of the Red Sea. From there, humans spread eastward into India, Southeast Asia, and eventually reached the edge of the world they knew, with the vast Pacific Ocean. The distances were staggering, yet within only a few thousand years, humans had crossed them. By 65,000 years ago, people had already reached Australia, navigating stretches of open sea to settle its wild and alien continent. These early voyagers were not only survivors, but pioneers. Along the coasts of India and Indonesia, they gathered shellfish and fashioned tools from bone and stone. In Australia, they adapted to environments no human had ever seen before: deserts, rainforests, and strange marsupial megafauna. Some of their rock art still survives, painted on cave walls tens of thousands of years ago. The figures they left, the stylized humans, animals, spirits, are among the oldest works of art in the world, whispers from the dawn of imagination. Meanwhile, other groups moved northward into the Middle East and Europe. There, they encountered an ancient people who had long thrived in those lands, the Neanderthals. Stocky, resilient, skilled hunters, the Neanderthals had weathered Europe's ice ages for hundreds of thousands of years. To them, the newcomers must have seemed fragile, with their slighter builds and strange ways. Yet these meetings were not always hostile. The DNA of modern Europeans still carries the imprint of Neanderthal blood, proof that these encounters were not only of conflict, but of intimacy. Still, over time, Homo sapiens would prevail. By 40,000 years ago, humans had spread across Europe, and the Neanderthals had begun to fade into extinction. In caves at Chauvet and Lascaux in France, paintings left by our ancestors show herds of bison, lions, and mammoths rendered in astonishing detail. These were not mere decorations. They were expressions of memory, of ritual, of a mind reaching out beyond survival. With ochre and charcoal, Humans claimed the world around them not only as a place to live, but as a place to imagine. The exodus out of Africa did not end there. By 45,000 years ago, humans had entered Siberia, braving its frozen plains. By 20,000 years ago, they crossed into the Americas, perhaps by following herds of mammoth across the Bering Land Bridge that once connected Asia to Alaska. Within only a few thousand years, humans had spread across North and South America, reaching even the southernmost tip of Patagonia. The journey that began in the Rift Valley of Africa had carried us to every corner of the earth. It is difficult to overstate the magnitude of this migration. No other species had ever spread so far, across so many environments. From the deserts of Arabia to the ice sheets of Europe, from the tropical forests of the Amazon to the high Andes, humans adapted. They crafted new tools, built new shelters, learned to hunt new animals, and forage for new plants. In doing so, they became not just wanderers, but masters of survival. And yet, these journeys were not only physical, they were spiritual as well. To walk into unknown lands, to face the terror of the unfamiliar, was also to invent stories that made sense of it. Everywhere our ancestors went, they carried myths with them, stories of creation, of spirits, of ancestors who guided and protected them. In these tales, the world was not a blank map, but a living landscape filled with meaning. Through myth, humans domesticated not only land, but fear. The scale of the Exodus is almost beyond comprehension. By the end of the Ice Age, around 12,000 years ago, our species had reached every habitable continent on Earth. We had crossed deserts, jungles, rivers, and oceans, leaving behind a trail of tools, art, and bones that mark our passage. From a single cradle in Africa, humanity had become a planetary force. And yet, even in this triumph, there was tragedy. As we spread, other hominins vanished. The Neanderthals of Europe, the Denisovans of Asia, and the Hobbit people of Flores in Indonesia all disappeared within the shadow of our expansion. Their absence reminds us that the Exodus was not merely a journey of exploration, but also of replacement. Wherever we went, we survived. Others did not. When we think of the first Exodus, it is tempting to picture a single figure, a man, perhaps standing at the edge of the Red Sea, gazing across the waters toward Arabia, taking the first step into the wider world. But in truth, it was not a single man, nor a single moment. It was countless footsteps, countless families, countless children carried into new lands. The Exodus was not one story, but many, woven together into the great tapestry of humanity. The myths echo this truth in their own way. The Bible speaks of exile from Eden, of leaving a home once perfect and walking into the wilderness. Polynesian tales tell of great sea voyages, guided by stars and spirits across the vast Pacific. In nearly every culture, stories survive of migrations, journeys, and wanderings, echoes of that primal memory when humanity itself first left its cradle. The Exodus from Africa was the beginning of everything. From it would come the rise of villages, of kingdoms, of empires. From it would come the shaping of landscapes, the extinction of beasts, the invention of gods. But at its heart, it was a human story, the story of people who walked away from the familiar, carrying only fire, tools, and dreams, and made the whole earth their home. The world into which the first men wandered was not like our own. It was harsher, colder, and more unforgiving, a planet ruled by ice. For tens of thousands of years, vast glaciers blanketed much of the northern hemisphere. Ice sheets miles thick pressed down upon Europe, Asia, and North America, grinding mountains into rubble, carving valleys, and locking away the oceans in frozen prisons. In such an age, survival was not guaranteed. It demanded not only strength of body, but ingenuity of mind. Our ancestors were small in number, scattered across immense landscapes. Each band had only the tools they could make, the shelters they could build, and the food they could gather or hunt. Yet, they were not helpless. In the midst of ice, they discovered a power older than humanity itself: fire. Fire was the great divider, the force that separated man from beast. It had long been known to other hominins, perhaps to Homo erectus, for hundreds of thousands of years before. But during the Ice Age, fire became essential. Around its warmth, men and women could survive the winter's bite. With it, they cooked food, making it easier to digest, unlocking energy for hungry brains. By firelight, they kept predators at bay, extending the day into the night. Fire was more than survival, it was community. It brought people together in the circle of its glow, where stories were told, songs sung, and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. But fire alone could not conquer the ice. Shelter was also needed. In Europe, the people of the Ice Age built homes from mammoth bones and hides, creating sturdy frames to ward off the cold. Others found refuge in caves, whose stone walls still bear the marks of their presence. Handprints, paintings, and carvings that whisper of lives lived long ago. In these caves, the Ice Age men left their legacy not only in bones, but in art. The paintings at Chauvet, Altamira, and Lascaux are among the greatest treasures of our species. By torchlight, hunters painted mammoths, bison, lions, and horses with astonishing skill. They captured motion, depth, and spirit, transforming stone walls into living theaters. Why they did this remains a mystery. Perhaps it was ritual, a way to summon success in the hunt. Perhaps it was a myth, an attempt to weave meaning into a dangerous world. Or perhaps it was simply the joy of creation, the first flowering of imagination. Whatever the reason, the art of the Ice Age shows us that even in the darkest of winters, humanity dreamed. Tools, to have advanced in this age. The flint blades of earlier men gave way to more refined weapons, needles carved from bone, spear throwers that extended the arm's reach, and harpoons to fish the icy rivers and seas. With these tools, humans spread farther and hunted bigger game. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and giant deer all fell before the skill of Ice Age hunters. Yet, with each kill, humans shaped the balance of the world, pushing some species toward extinction. It is here that the duality of man becomes clear. The Ice Age tested human resilience, but it also revealed human power. No longer were men mere survivors, clinging to life in the shadow of beasts. They had become hunters who could stand against the largest animals on Earth. In doing so, they changed not only themselves but the ecosystems they entered. But the Ice Age was not unbroken. Between the coldest periods, the climate shifted. The ice retreated, forests returned, rivers swelled. And then, just as quickly, the glaciers surged again, reclaiming the land. For our ancestors, this cycle of ice and fire meant constant adaptation. They moved with the seasons, with the herds, with the shifting lines of survival. To live in this age was to live in motion, never certain of what the earth would bring. It was also an age of encounters. In Europe, the descendants of Africa's exodus met the Neanderthals, whose stout bodies were built for the cold. For thousands of years, the two species lived side by side, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in union. Their blood mingled, leaving traces that survive in our DNA today. Yet, as the Ice Age deepened, Neanderthals began to fade. Whether by climate, competition, or simply the weight of time, they vanished, leaving modern humans as the sole heirs of the world. Meanwhile, in Asia, another cousin of Denisovans left only fragments of bone and teeth, yet their genetic imprint lives on in the peoples of Melanesia and Tibet. In Africa, other lineages may have lingered, shadows of forgotten tribes now lost to history. The Ice Age was not merely a test of humanity. It was a crucible in which entire peoples were forged, merged, or extinguished. And yet, amidst the cold, there were sparks of brilliance. It was during the Ice Age that language blossomed, that symbols and rituals became central to human life. Burial sites reveal graves adorned with beads, ochre, and ornaments, evidence that the dead were mourned, that lives were remembered, that humans had begun to ask questions of meaning. Who are we? What comes after death? What is the place of man in the cosmos? These questions, born in firelight and whispered in the caves, would echo through millennia, shaping myth, religion, and philosophy. The age of ice and fire was not only about the survival of the body, it was the dawn of the human spirit. By the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, the glaciers began their final retreat. Seas rose, forests spread, and the world softened into a warmer climate. Humanity emerged from this crucible transformed. They had endured tens of thousands of years of cold, hunger, and struggle. They had crossed continents, hunted giants, painted walls, buried their dead, and sung their stories. They were no longer a fragile band of wanderers from Africa. They were masters of adaptation, poised to build villages, plant crops, and raise civilizations. When the ice melted, the world of history as we know it began. But the memory of the Ice Age never left us. It lingers in the myths of a flood that covers the earth, in the legends of fire stolen from the gods, in the tales of giants and monsters that once walked the land. These stories are echoes of a time when man battled not armies or empires, but the earth itself. The age of ice and fire was the proving ground of humanity. It was here, amid glaciers and mammoths, firelight and shadows, that we became who we are. The world tested us with cold and darkness, and we answered with fire and imagination. In that struggle, the first men carved out the foundations of all that would follow. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity's story was one of movement. Bands of men and women followed the herds, gathered fruits and roots, crossed rivers and mountains in search of tomorrow's meal. To be human was to be restless, never bound to one place, never trusting that the land beneath your feet would provide enough for the next season. But as the Ice Age receded, the world itself began to change. And with it, so did man. When the glaciers melted, the sea levels rose and the climate warmed. Grasslands turned to forests, rivers grew, and wild grains swayed in the wind. Animals that once roamed in great herds began to retreat, some vanishing forever. The mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, and the giant deer became ghosts of another age. In their place came smaller game gazelles, wild sheep, and goats. For the first time, human survival seemed less about endless wandering and more about learning to stay. It is in this fragile, uncertain age, around 12,000 years ago, that we find the first signs of settlement. In the hills of the Fertile Crescent, a crescent-shaped arc of land stretching from Mesopotamia through the Levant into Egypt, groups of hunter-gatherers began to linger in one place. They built shelters of stone and mud, not merely temporary huts, but dwellings meant to endure through seasons. Villages like Jericho and Catalhayuk grew from these early experiments, clusters of homes with hearths, courtyards, and walls that suggest something astonishing: permanence. But what bound them to the land was not only shelter, it was food. Among the wild grasses of the Fertile Crescent, humans discovered that seeds scattered near their camps returned the next season as new plants. By accident or design, they began to sow and harvest. Barley, wheat, and lentil, once gathered wild, were now cultivated. Goats and sheep, once hunted, were now penned and bred. Slowly, a revolution took root. This was the agricultural revolution, and it was unlike anything before it. For the first time, food was no longer solely at the mercy of nature's whims. With effort, planning, and patience, humans could shape their own survival. The rhythms of life shifted, from the chase of the hunt to the cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. Seasons became more than they became the calendar of existence. But farming was not simply a new way of eating. It reshaped the very structure of society. A settled village meant more mouths in one place, and more mouths meant cooperation and conflict. Rules were needed to share fields, water, and harvests. Leaders emerged, elders and chiefs who could resolve disputes and guide the group. With stability came growth. Villages expanded. Families multiplied. Within generations, the population of the earth began to swell. And as numbers grew, so did culture. The permanence of settlement freed human hands and minds. Tools became more refined, not just stone blades, but sickles for cutting grain, grinding stones for making flour, and pottery for storing food. Fire, once a defense against cold and darkness, became the hearth of the household, where bread was baked, meals shared, and stories passed. The earliest settlements also nurtured something even more profound: the beginnings of religion as we know it. In Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, archaeologists uncovered great stone pillars carved with animals, arranged in circles that predate farming itself. Here, hunters and gatherers gathered not to live, but to worship. These monuments suggest that long before temples of brick and stone, humans already gathered to commune with the unseen. The act of building Toged, her of raising pillars to gods, spirits, and ancestors was itself a step towards civilization. Yet, the seeds of settlement carried both promise and peril. Farming offered more food, but it also demanded backbreaking labor. Fields had to be cleared, watered, and defended. Crops failed with droughts, pests, or floods. Unlike the hunter who could follow the herds, the farmer was bound to the soil. If the land failed, hunger came. Skeletons from the earliest farming communities reveal stunted growth, malnutrition, and disease. Settled life brought not only bread, but sickness spread through close contact with animals, waste, and crowded living. Still, the experiment persisted. For in settlement lay something that wandering could never provide: accumulation. A nomad carries only what he can walk with. A farmer stores grain, pottery, tools, and memories. Wealth measured not in coins, but in livestock, harvests, and land began to divide one family from another. For the first time, humanity began to know inequality. Inequality brought conflict, but it also brought innovation. To manage surpluses, humans invented counting, tokens, and eventually writing. To protect harvests, they raised walls, and with walls came warfare. The humble seeds sown in the soil did not merely grow food. They grew villages, then cities, then kingdoms. Civilization itself was born from this quiet revolution. And yet, in those earliest days, it was still fragile. Settlement was a gamble, a choice that bound people to the earth in a way no generation before them had ever dared. The first men who planted seeds did not know that they were beginning a transformation that would lead, in time, to pyramids, empires, and skyscrapers. They knew only that in the earth lay the promise of tomorrow's meal. We must pause and imagine what it felt like to be the first man who scattered seeds and waited. He must have watched the soil with hope and fear, unsure if it would answer. When the first shoots appeared, green against the dark soil, it must have seemed a kind of magic. The earth itself had become an ally. For the first time, man was not only shaped by the land, but he was shaping it. The myths remember this moment. In Sumerian tales, agriculture is a gift of the gods. In the story of Cain and Abel, one brother is a farmer, the other a herdsman, and the first conflict is born from settlement and the division of labor. Across the world, from Native American legends of corn maidens to African tales of yam spirits, the memory of planting and harvest is woven into the sacred. It was, after all, the turning point that made us who we are. The seeds of settlement did not sprout everywhere at once. In China, millet and rice were domesticated along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. In the Americas, maize, beans, and squash formed the foundation of civilizations. In Africa, sorghum and yams sustained communities. Each continent, each river valley, birthed its own agricultural revolution. Yet all shared the same destiny. From settlement would come complexity, from fields would rise temples, from villages would grow nations. Looking back, the transformation seems inevitable, as though humanity was always destined to trade the bow for the plow, the tent for the village. But to those who lived it, it was no certainty. It was a choice, a leap into the unknown, as daring as the first exodus out of Africa. For by planting roots in the soil, humanity also planted roots in time. The first men of the world, once wanderers, became builders of homes, of families, of futures. The Ice Age had tested our endurance. Fire had tested our ingenuity. The settlement tested our imagination. Could we envision a life not of wandering, but of staying? Could we trust the land to sustain us, year after year? Could we build not only for ourselves, but for our children's children? The seeds of settlement were not merely seeds of grain. They were seeds of destiny. From them would grow the long, tangled story of civilization itself. The first seeds of settlement gave rise to villages, and villages became towns. But as humanity clustered ever more tightly upon the land, something new emerged, something more enduring than huts and harvests. It was power, and with it came the shaping of societies into patterns that would echo for millennia, the worship of gods above and the rule of kings below. In the earliest days, the line between the two was blurred. To live in a village was to share not only the soil, but the stories that bound its people together. The earth gave grain, the sky gave rain, and the sun gave light. These were not abstract forces. They were living presences, spirits, or deities who governed the fragile balance of survival. A failed harvest was not merely drought, but it was divine displeasure. A flood was not a chance, it was the hand of a god. Archaeologists uncover this shift in places like Catalhoyuk in Anatolia, where shrines adorned with bull skulls and figurines of great mother goddesses suggest an early reverence for fertility and strength. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets reveal offerings made to gods of rivers, storms, and fields, each tied to the vital elements of survival. Across the Fertile Crescent, the natural world was slowly reimagined as a divine order, one that demanded human attention, ritual, and devotion. But with gods came their earthly stewards. As villages grew, leaders emerged not only to manage fields and disputes, but to mediate between the human and the divine. Shamans, priests, and chiefs claimed authority as voices of the unseen. Their power rested not in muscle or spear, but in the belief that they spoke with the gods or were chosen by them. The roots of kingship were planted here, in the merging of earthly rule and divine sanction. By 5,000 years ago, the first true cities arose in Mesopotamia. In Uruk, towering walls encircled thousands of people. At its heart stood Zig, Urat's stair-step temples that rose toward the heavens, monuments of clay and devotion. Here, gods like Inanna and Anu reigned supreme, and kings ruled as their earthly representatives. Writing, once marks upon clay to count grain, expanded into hymns, laws, and chronicles. Humanity had entered history. The Nile Valley also birthed its kings. In Egypt, the pharaoh was no mere ruler. He was divine, the living Horus, the son of Ra. His command extended not only over fields and rivers, but over the very order of the cosmos, what the Egyptians called Ma'at. To serve the pharaoh was to uphold balance in the universe. And so, men raised monuments of impossible scale, the pyramids of Giz, stone mountains built to honor gods and preserve the souls of kings for eternity. Across the world, similar patterns unfolded. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa displayed order and planning that hinted at powerful elites guiding the flow of life. In China, the Shang kings presided over rituals with oracle bones, calling upon ancestors and spirits to bless their reign. Everywhere, the story repeated. Where settlement grew, gods and kings soon followed. Why did this happen? The answer lies in the scale of human society. A band of 30 wanderers needs no king, for disputes are settled face to face. But a city of tens of thousands demands hierarchy. It demands authority, order, and belief to bind strangers into one people. Religion and kingship provided this glue. By claiming divine favor, rulers justified their power. By participating in ritual, communities found meaning and solidarity. The dawn of gods and kings was not an accident. It was the necessary architecture of civilization. But power, once born, does not sit idle. Kings built armies, and armies built empires. In Mesopotamia, Sargon of Akkad forged the first empire, conquering city after city until the land between the rivers bowed to his rule. He declared himself not only king but steward of the gods, a man whose reign was blessed by heaven itself. In doing so, he set a precedent followed by countless rulers after him. Religion, too, has evolved. The earliest gods of river and field grew into vast pantheons, their stories interwoven with the destinies of nations. Myths of creation, of floods, of divine battles gave people a sense of origin and purpose. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh told of a king's quest for immortality, reflecting humanity's growing awareness of mortality and legacy. In Egypt, the myth of Osiris spoke of death and resurrection, offering hope beyond the grave. These myths were more than tales. They were frameworks of understanding, answers to the questions that haunted the first men who gazed upon the stars. Who made us? Why do we die? What lies beyond? Through gods and kings, humanity began to articulate its deepest fears and highest aspirations. Yet this age also revealed a darker truth. That power, once claimed, is seldom shared. Kingship created order, but it also created inequality on a scale unknown before. The gap between farmer and ruler widened, enforced by armies and justified by priests. The labor of thousands built the temples and palaces of the few. In the shadows of ziggurats and pyramids, ordinary men and women toiled, their sweat and blood transmuted into monuments of stone and divine glory. Still, there was awe. To stand before the pyramids, to climb the steps of a ziggurat, was to feel the presence of something greater than awe, whether God, king, or both. These monuments endured because they embodied more than power. They embodied the human longing for permanence, for meaning, for a connection between heaven and earth. The dawn of gods and kings was not confined to the old world. In the Americas, too, civilizations rose. The Olmecs of Mesoamerica carved colossal heads of stone, their rulers immortalized in features that stare across millennia. In Peru, the Norte Chico built monumental pyramids while cultivating the harsh coastal valleys. Though separated by oceans, these people, too, raised leaders and deities to guide them, proving that the pattern was universal. In every land, the first men and women of civilization stood at the threshold of something new, a world where the divine and the political intertwined, where kings claimed the heavens to justify the earth. This merging of power and belief would shape history's great empires from Babylon to Rome, from the pharaohs to the emperors of China. It would shape wars, laws, and cultures, for to challenge a king was to defy a god. But with belief came questions. If kings were divine, why did they die? If gods were all-powerful, why did floods and famines still strike? These tensions would spark revolutions of thought, prophets, philosophers, and reformers who sought new ways to understand the divine and the just. The dawn of gods and kings was not the end of humanity's search for meaning. It was only the beginning. We must picture, then, a figure from this age, not a hunter or a wanderer, but a man standing in the shadow of a temple. He gazes upward at towering walls, at carved figures of gods whose eyes seem to watch him. Around him, thousands labor, ruled by kings he may never meet. For the first time, humanity belongs not only to family and band, but to something larger, a kingdom, a civilization, a destiny shaped by gods above and rulers below. It was here, in the dawn of gods and kings, that humanity crossed another threshold. From scattered villages came cities. From stories around a fire came written myth. From chiefs came kings. From shamans came priests. From survival came civilization. The journey of the first man, once measured in footsteps across plains and rivers, was now measured in the rise of monuments, the rule of dynasties, and the worship of gods. And though empires would rise and fall, though kings would be remembered or forgotten, the pattern they set, the intertwining of belief and power, would endure. It was the inheritance of every civilization that followed, an inheritance born when men first raised temples to the sky and crowned rulers as sons of heaven. As we trace the journey from the first tentative steps of humanity to the rise of thriving settlements, it becomes clear that early humans were no longer mere wanderers of the landscape. They were builders, innovators, and thinkers. They tamed rivers to irrigate crops, shaped stone and bronze into tools and weapons, and organized themselves into communities bound by laws, ritual, and shared purpose. Cities began to rise, each street and marketplace a testament to ingenuity and ambition. Civilization, once a fragile experiment, had begun to take shape in all its complexity. Yet with complexity came vulnerability. The same irrigation canals that fed cities could flood or fail. The social hierarchies that brought order could breed inequality and unrest. Trade networks, while connecting distant lands, introduced dependencies that could unravel under strain. Human ambition, so vital to the rise of these early civilizations, also sowed the seeds of rivalry and conflict. Nature and circumstance were never static. Droughts, disease, and shifting climates loomed on the horizon. As we leave part 1, we witness civilizations at their peak: monumental architecture, organized governance, technological mastery, and rich cultural expression. But these triumphs were fragile, balanced precariously on the limits of environment, society, and human behavior. The stage is set for the trials that would test the endurance of the first humans, the challenges that would topple cities, reshape societies, and transform the very foundations of civilization. What happens when ingenuity collides with catastrophe? How did early humans respond when the delicate balance of their world began to unravel? Part 2 will explore the rise and fall of these ancient societies, revealing not only the fragility of civilization, but also the resilience and creativity that allowed humanity to endure and to leave a legacy that continues to shape our world today. Civilization had risen from the dust, rivers were tamed, cities thrived, and humanity's ingenuity seemed unstoppable. But every empire has its shadows. What happens when the very innovations that built these societies begin to crumble? When floods, famine, conflict, and ambition collide? The story of humanity's first civilizations is far from over. Click part 2 to witness the collapse, transformation, and the enduring legacy of the first humans in the world.